Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to be here today and to talk to you about the e-general consent, which is a project with many project partners. It's not cutting-edge research, it's not a big project, but I think it's something that's very important, and if you look closely, it's rather complex. Let's see if that works, yeah. So there are many applicants, all the hospitals, the university hospitals are involved. We also have people from the SCTO, Swiss PetNet, and the Swiss Biobanking platform on board. And I'm going to just give you a brief overview over what we're planning to do. It's probably not going to take 15 minutes. Probably we will use the time that I don't need here now afterwards for questions, because there's a lot to discuss about how we managed to do that. Let's see. Okay. So here's the agenda. I'm going to give you a short introduction to the general consent as we understand it for the project. How does it work today? What are the problems with this approach? What do we propose to do? Who are the project partners? What are our work packages? And what is the current progress of our project? So the introduction to the general consent. It's an agreement of patients for the use of routinely collected personal health-related data and biological material for research purposes. So here I would like to take a short detour. Is any one of you familiar with the term a power pose? And it's like doing this for 2 minutes. So this has been some work from Amy Cuddy and her colleagues at the Harvard Business School, and they found out that when you tell people to do this pose for 2 minutes before they present, they're actually able to perform better because the hormone levels change and you get more resilient to stress. So how would you do such a study? You have an idea, you go and say, well, we write a study protocol, you go to the ethics committee, maybe not for this study, and say, are we allowed to do this? You find your patients, you tell them what you're going to do, you get an informed written consent from them, and then you randomize your patients and you conduct your study and you analyze the data. Simple. Now this is something completely different. There is nobody who has a brilliant idea and says, well, I'm going to find my patients and I'm going to tell them what I'm going to do exactly. This is about a patient goes to the hospital and we ask them to give us consent to use all the things that we collect from them for whatever we want we come up in the future. Try to explain it to a patient. So how does it work today? All the university hospitals, they already established this process. And it's a paper-based process. It's a paper-based consent information that is given as part of the regular admission process. So you get a nice form, maybe even a brochure with that, and you give it to the patient when they enter the hospital or when you send them all the information about the stay in the hospital. And the patient will at some point sign the document and hand it back, usually at in- and outpatient admission desks. These forms have then been collected and brought to a central facility, and they are either entered manually into a computer system, or in several hospitals they are scanned and then brought automatically into the computer systems at the hospital. So basically this is what we're doing at the hospital all the time. This is a familiar process and there should be no problem with that. So what is the problem with this approach? So let's say these are all the patients that you see in the hospital. It's about 150 of these symbols. So these are the patients that are admitted to the hospital. Now, when we give them the consent form, we have about 10 to 20% exposed. And these are actual numbers that we collected at the hospital, so we were interested how well does this process work. So from all the patients that we see, about 10 to 20% actually get the form. So what is the problem with that? So basically there are many different ways how you can get into the hospital, and usually the consent research is not at the forefront of the people working at admission. So basically maybe it gets skipped or you have too much to do. And then of those 20%, about 5 to 10% return the sheet. And if they return, or in the case of oncology, when the doctors specifically ask patients, 58% or higher agree to give the data and all the specimens and genomic data. So it's great if people give us an answer. They are usually agreed to do that, but the problem is we have about 2 of 150, or 1 out of 75 patients that we actually are allowed to do everything that we talk about here. So all this great data sharing, huge advances in genomics, and we can only use the data of 1 of 75 patients. So why is this a problem? Well, there's something called selection bias. So in this study I told you earlier about, you choose your patients, you randomize them, and then you hope that the groups that you explore are somewhat similar and don't differ in what you do. Only the treatment is the thing that you change. So here, it's not a random selection of the population. It's very specific patients that get this form and that return the form. So we have a huge problem with a so-called selection bias. Now, what do we propose to do? We would like to increase the general consent coverage by establishing an entire digital consent process that is paper-free, that frees up a lot of resources in the hospital, and is independent of hospital admission. And this one is very crucial. So the problem is, I don't know how many of you have a transplant donor license. You can even say on the transplant donor license, you can say, I don't want to give anything. Most people don't know that. And the way that the numbers that we have in Switzerland are quite low. So the problem is, if no one is responsible to ask the patient, then those numbers will likely be very low. So we need to be able to, at every step in the hospital, tell patients, well, we saw that you didn't give any, let's say, opinion about if you want to give your data for research or not. And we should ask them to do this now, with as little effort as possible from the side of the hospital staff, because they are usually concerned with treating the patient and less with research. So who are the project partners? We have all the university hospitals on board. We have the Swiss Clinical Trial Organization, Swiss PetNet, and Swiss Biobanking Platforms. And we have in all these institutions, we have one person who is our direct partner, but at all these institutions, there are several people working for this project and trying to make this work. So the work package 1 is very simple, you would say. We want to establish a solution for a digital patient identification and a written consent within the Swiss legal framework. So how do you identify the patient who is giving you the signature? And what does a written consent mean if it's on a mobile phone? So these are short questions, but it's really hard to answer them. And we have many, many people working on this. So we have national and local experts. They are working with the Swiss Academy of Medical Science, with Swiss Ethics, and also with the authorities to find a solution that is not only in the Swiss legal framework, but also practical in real life. Because we have to bring all these patients that come to this hospital through this system. And we won't get rid of the paper-based system, just to give you a little bit peace of mind, because there will always be patients that don't have a mobile phone or don't want to use the mobile phone to do that. So the work package 2 is to develop a digital representation of a general consent based on a nationwide harmonized content. So now that the consents that we have in the hospitals, they differ, and they differ partially substantially. And now we have a national consent template, which is not used by any hospital. So we try to bring the right people together so we get a harmonized national consent version that we only have one, and you don't have to say, well, if the data is from Geneva, you're allowed to do that. If the data is from Bern, you are not allowed to do that, but you can do something different with that. So this is also quite some work, and I think we already have a version that has found a high agreement, and we are quite positive that this can be actually achieved. And then the third work package is to develop and test a validated software solution to be used by all involved hospitals. So the idea is you have a turnkey integration, you plug this into the hospital. And here is the big difference to another project for the general consent. So there are two projects. One is this one, which is about using the general consent in the hospital, and it's only valid for the hospital that you're staying in. So basically, your relation is to the hospital, and you give the hospital consent to give the data out. Then there's a different concept, which is the consent shouldn't live with a hospital. It belongs to a patient. So basically, I would say I give consent that anybody is allowed to use my data. It doesn't matter if I go to the University Hospital Zurich or to the Hospital St. Gallen or to my general practitioner. As long as I give consent, you are allowed to use my data for clinical research. And I don't have to give it to every provider separately. I think it's a little bit off until we're there. Maybe with the e-patient dossier, we get there. But this is sort of like, we want to ideally have this in 1 year, so we can say, okay, now we can really increase the rates that we have for the general consent, because otherwise we don't have the data to work on for the driver projects. And for the current status, we would actually start in May with the project. We are doing some preliminary work now, getting everybody on board, finding this harmonized content so we can then start to work on a digital version. And we would also like to involve patients more here, so we plan to do lots of prototyping and testing with patients in hospitals to see if what we do is actually beneficial for patients and if they can understand what we're trying to tell them.